Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue right along with our discussion on the Vietnam War. So in our last lecture we examined some of the opening events, some of the events that set the stage for later United States heavy involvement in Vietnam, namely Johnson's decision to be seen as tough on communism, to be seen as someone who was a hardliner, particularly after the election of 1964. There was a very damning charge made by his Republican opponent, Barry Goldwater, that Johnson was weak on communism. There was also the post World War II realignment or reordering of the world, in which during the war the Japanese Empire had conquered Vietnam from the French, and after the war local Vietnamese forces, in addition to Allied forces that helped to oust the Japanese from Vietnam, and many of the local Vietnamese leaders expected to regain their independence. They expected to receive formal acknowledgement from the other powers of the world that Vietnam was indeed independent. They were dismayed to find that the United States and the other powers granted Vietnam back to France. They attempted to reset the clock before the French lost control to the Japanese, an event that could not be undone. All the powers of the world had seen Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, all of these other European colonies be taken over with ease by Japanese force that was able to meet the European forces on a even and level playing field and best them. Such lessons couldn't be unlearned. And it really sort of spell out the narrative of Vietnamese resistance to the French attempts and later United States attempts to dominate them. And with that being said, we'll pick up with our narrative, with our full-on lecture narrative, and we'll begin with the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred in 1964. And it provided Johnson with a rationale for increasing the American presence in Vietnam. Two United States ships, the Maddox and the Turner Joy, were observing the efforts of the South Vietnamese army to take islands held by forces loyal to Ho Chi Minh in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now the ships were attacked by a North Vietnamese gunboat, the Maddox and the Turner Joy. They were attacked by a North Vietnamese gunboat, helping in the North Vietnamese effort to repel the attack on the islands. Now, the United States alleged that the attack had been won unprovoked, and this sort of gave Johnson the pretext to ask the United States Senate to pass a resolution authorizing him as president to use force to secure American interests in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, Johnson used this resolution that was only opposed by two senators to further escalate the conflict from that point on. From that point on, the number of American troops in Vietnam ratcheted upwards from 16,000 at the time of Kennedy's death, reaching a high water point, the great high water point in Vietnam of over 500,000. 500,000 men in 1968. The American expectations of success were reasonable. Now, after all, the United States had learned a lot regarding long-term and long-distance combat from World War II. When we compare armies and we compare abilities, excuse me. The campaigns in the Pacific during World War II had taught the United States military forces a lot of lessons about combating tropical forests, and particularly the island hopping campaigns against Imperial Japan had taught the United States a lot about encountering entrenched forces with modern weaponry. Now, the forces of North Vietnam were poorly armed. the Viet Cong was a very low-tech fighting force. But right from the beginning, they were reluctant to use, the United States was reluctant to use too much force for fears of prompting a Chinese or Russian intervention. Like what happened in Vietnam. The United States was winning the war using somewhat subdued methods. And when they ratcheted up, in their opinion, when they ratcheted up this attempt to not just restore the original demarcation line, but when they attempted to use their overwhelming military force and capabilities to invade and conquer and snuff out communism in North Vietnam, it sort of led to this this opening, this eye-opening experience for the other communist powers, who began to send in aid, war material, and of course men to help defend North Vietnam, North Korea, sorry. Now, the United States Army was not given the authorization to invade and defeat the North Vietnamese on their own ground. The war was seen and prosecuted as a holding action to hold the Vietnamese and force them to give way and to accept the viability and the long-term standing of South Vietnam. Now, the senior commanders of the military at the time deeply disliked the strategy, as it seemed to prolong the conflict and gave no definite end to the engagement. The hope was that the United States Army will be able to wear down the resolve of the North Vietnamese. But it was the American resolve that was eventually broken down, and it broke down rather quickly, as there was no vital interest for the United States really in Vietnam. Now, very quickly, a pattern developed where during the day, United States forces would come out and patrol en masse, and they would hold these military operations in these remote country villages, these rural villages, and exert great control seemingly over these villages. And then at night, the Viet Cong would come in and exert complete control over the same regions, over these same rural villages. This seesawing saw the Vietnamese peasants placed in a very extreme and unfortunate predicament. Their position would certainly not be envied by anybody else. They would have to, at all times, be aware of who was operating and who was around. When the United States was around, they had to give the impression that they were pro-American, that they supported South Vietnam's government. When the Viet Cong came around, they had to give the impression that they supported Ho Chi Minh and that they were communists themselves. This can sort of wear on a people over time. They were vulnerable. And they had to make these constant illustrations of loyalty to whoever showed up, whenever they showed up. And the ground situation literally changed like that every day within 24 hours. The terrain and the forest really limited the fighting style and the battle training of the United States Army. The terrain, the climate, the tropical forest, and then of course the guerrilla fighting style employed by the Viet Cong nullified all of those technological advances that the United States had. The United States came in with this sort of self-image of being a vaunted military force. They had these battle tanks that they could not use in combat. You could not take those tanks into the tropical forest of Vietnam. Interestingly enough, the Jeep, as we understand it, the vehicle, came about because of rapid response and quick movement needs of the United States military. The Jeep, and Jeep is an acronym for it as well. But they were employed as vehicles that can be that could act as like sort of mobile cavalry. Four-wheeled cavalry that can come in and deliver quick punches of overwhelming assault when needed, when necessary. We also saw the rise of helicopters has attacking and suppressing fire forces, also within rapid movement forces for United States United States forces, for the United States Army during this time. Both of them gave the United States a great advantage, the Jeep and the helicopter. But they were beyond the grasp of the United States to win what was called the battle for the hearts and the minds of the Vietnamese in the countryside. The Vietnam War was challenging for the United States Army, had it been bred and trained to fight in set battles, and classically defined field battles in which you had sort of like open space and two armies coming towards each other and slugging it out, with the best led, the best equipped army usually coming away as the victor. None of the advantages that they had expected to fight a war using was available for them to deploy, for them to use. The army was very ill at ease in having to fight battles in these restricting forested areas. A sense of dread and fatigue quickly set in among the men who were shuffled in and out of combat, with many displaying anxiety over traveling for combat by foot, traveling for combat using armored vehicles or helicopters. And eventually a system was put in place in which men would serve for a year-long tour of duty, and then return home. And that's similarly still the pattern for American forces. In the early years of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was 2 years to 18 months. And then about a decade ago, for Iraq, it was dropped from 18 months to exactly 12 months. And I remember a unit that I was in, they got wind of it. Guys got wind of it, and they thought that, oh wow, this is going to cut our deployment time by that much. You know, they were quickly approaching that year mark. And then command came out and said that applied for guys coming after the proclamation, not for you guys here. You guys are going to stay a full months. The next deployment was only 12 months, but that quickly became the pattern. A year of fighting and a year back home, so as not to expose the troops to this sort of morale crushing, spirit dampening existence, sort of pessimistic dread. And then also the concept of R&R, rest and relaxation, sort of came into play, in which guys during this combat tour would have breaks from combat. They would have breaks from the monotony of life on campaign, in which they would be able to go to demilitarized zones, heavily commercialized zones within the theater. You still have that in Iraq and Afghanistan, but mostly when you have R&R, it's a decision to come back home and spend time with friends and family and other loved ones back in the continental U.S. Although it's not unusual for guys to simply take this as an opportunity to go someplace that they never had the opportunity to go before, like Berlin or Leipzig. Now, beyond that, there was a great uncertainty, at least for the men, regarding the loyalties of the local population. As I spoke about earlier, the local people may be expected to, on any given notice, come out and say that they support the United States Army or that they support the Vietnamese Army on any given note without with little notice. Now, this led to a series of atrocities being committed by the United States forces in Vietnam against local populations. The most infamous of which, or the most well-known of which, was the My Lai massacre, which shocked the Republic in 1969 and led to the court-martial and conviction of Lieutenant Calley for ordering the killing of over 200 Vietnamese civilians. Now, morale fell throughout the units, and another unfortunate practice developed, and it's not unique by any chance, but it's called fragging. It's not unique to the Vietnam War, and it's not unique to the United States military. Fragging is the intentional killing of a superior for overzealous actions, or for actions that may result in heavy casualties, or just unpopular actions. Now, the term itself came from the habit of rolling a fragmentation grenade into the sleeping area of the target, and then disavowing all knowledge of the event. Fragging from fragmentation grenade. Now, fragging also came to be characterized by the shooting in the back of the target while on patrols. There were, and this is a low estimate, a minimum of over 700 documented fragging incidents in the late 60s and early 70s during the war. And fragging, it really does have a long history. Something that we would discuss in world history would be the death of King Charles XII of Sweden. He perhaps the most famous person to be fragged. He was shot in the back of the head by his own forces, and it's really unknown who did it. Norwegian soldiers claim to have done it, and then Swedish soldiers claim to have done it. But he had dragged Sweden through the Great Northern War, and it wasn't a war that he started. It was a conspiracy by local and regional opponents of his, those who wanted his possessions, his inherited possessions, in the East Baltic, and the North Sea area. What was I about to go say? Yeah, he was shot in the back of the head, and you can actually still see. I think there's still photos of it on the internet. They did an examination of his skull, trying to figure out exactly which musket ball from which army would have fired the shot that killed him. But he dragged his kingdom through the Great Northern War. He fought it against, amongst others, beginning with Frederick, who would later become Frederick the First, king in Prussia, and Peter the First of Russia. Largely disastrous for him and his nation. He would not concede defeat, and it was only with his death that the war came to an end, and we saw the immediate crash of Swedish political ambitions in northern Europe. We saw the immediate end of Sweden had the great power, or regional power, and the rise of Russia had a regional power in the eastern sphere of Europe, and then the northern sphere of Europe. St. Petersburg and like Finland are gained by the Russians during the time. Now, also in Vietnam, we see the rise of drug addiction among soldiers stationed over there. This was a real deep blow, and a problem through which command really didn't have any sort of counter for. Opioid cultivation was quite easy in Vietnam, and a very large and profitable drug trade grew between the Vietnamese people and soldiers stationed in Vietnam. There were, and this is just sort of a telling statistic, but there were four times as many hospitalizations for drug use, drug addiction, than for wounds in the hospitals in Vietnam. Many sort of point to Vietnam as the point in which the opioid epidemic really took hold in the United States. Now, domestic opposition to the war also became more widespread as young men began to resist the draft or to desert the army rather than go to war. Student deferments made it possible for young men to avoid the draft, and as a result, many found that they were really enthusiastic about higher education, and college enrollment was never higher than during the Vietnam War. Now, this created a social problem as the fighting had to be taken up by a disproportionate number of minority young men. Those who were unable to gain college admittance, those who were unable to pay for school or to seek deferments. They had to take up a disproportionate number of positions in the military, and also poor European Americans had to take up a very disproportionate amount of the burden of the weight of fighting this war. As wealthier Americans were able to avoid involvement in the war. Middle class men were altogether, middle class and upper class young men were altogether much less likely to wind up in combat or in the military than men from prosperous families. And even in situations where middle and upper class families found themselves or found sons facing the prospect of it, medical deferments or positions in state National Guards or state naval reserves or state air reserves, air guards, positions became available for them, and they were able to avoid combat while preserving some sense of honor for themselves. Now, Vietnam occurred during the CounterRevolution, during this great social revolution in the Republic. And the prospect of going over to fight a war that no one could explain to you, or a war that you didn't want to fight, made it socially respectable to oppose the war openly and in public while it was being fought by the Republic. Now, there were still those who were in favor of the war and looked down with dismay and disgust at people opposing the war and trying to get out of fighting the war. But there were still large anti-war demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and also on many college campuses. And this was unique in the nation's history because never before had young men gotten support for not going to war. In many families, this exacerbated the generational gap between parents on one hand and their children on the other. And many of these young men and many of these families, they would have had a situation where the father would either have been a World War I or a World War II, not a World War I, a World War II or a Korean War veteran, who would have looked upon this as your patriotic duty, had they a right or a test of citizenship to go off and fight in a war. And during the course of the war, 60,000 Americans died in Vietnam, and about 300,000 were wounded. And to sort of give you the reverse of that, it's estimated that roughly 2 million Vietnamese people died during the entire this high water engagement mark in Vietnam. Now, resistance to the war attracted a large number of supporters. In some cases, faculty came out and showed solidarity with students who were opposed to the war. Notable domestic figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. also spoke out against the war. And divisions in the United States prompted Lyndon Johnson to abandon his re-election plans in 1968. Now, the Tet Offensive of 1968 really sealed Johnson's fate. On January 31st, 1968, General William Westmoreland, the American ground commander, made a series of boasts, very public boasts, that he has sufficient forces on the ground to begin his final campaign to end the war. And yet, not long afterward, the Viet Cong launched a major offensive that threatened even the American embassy in Saigon. The campaign made Westmoreland and his claim appear nonsensical. The Tet Offensive was a major defeat on the ground, however, for the Vietnamese. It destroyed their ability to influence urban centers and greatly weakened all their forces on the ground. It's important to note that it was a trap. It was a very surprising attack, but one that failed outright to dislodge the Americans or even to defeat the Americans on the ground. This was an event in which the Americans were surprised, they met the challenge, and they repelled the challenge while destroying the regional infrastructure of the Viet Cong to launch further attacks on them. But the damage had been done. The poison was in the wound, as we say. It was a public relations coup for Ho Chi Minh. The offensive directly and very boldly, very loudly indicated that the United States government was not in a position to really win the war, to outright destroy them, that the United States did not have the sufficient intelligence to tell them where the Vietnamese would be operating. And it contradicted the claim made publicly by senior policy advisors that everything was under control, which was most damaging for the government. The credibility of the government was lost, and young people began to openly question the motivation of the government. The election scene in 1968 was even more dystopic, had the Democratic Party candidates split on continuing or halting the war. Once Johnson announced his retirement, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, became the forerunner, and he even opted to continue fighting the war to a conclusion out of respect for Lyndon Johnson. Now, Eugene McCarthy favored ending the war in the quickest way possible. Later, Robert Kennedy, then a sitting senator from Massachusetts, and of course the younger brother and the Attorney General during John Kennedy's administration, he entered the race. But he was tragically assassinated shortly after he won the California primary. And this just added more fuel to the fire of what was a very tiring and trying year for the Republic. 1968 was. Had the Democratic National Convention in 1960 bore out. Fights broke out between the police, Chicago police officers, and protesters. And Humphrey himself, while he received the nomination, he received the nomination from a party that was greatly divided and much weakened. There wasn't a strong push behind Humphrey. There wasn't a strong sense of unity behind the party. Meanwhile, Richard Nixon had managed to stage one of the most remarkable political comebacks, I would say, in the history of the world. Definitely the greatest political comeback of the 1960s. He came back and he won the Republican Party's nomination after that disastrous, well, not really disastrous, but the very humbling defeat he had in 1960. Nixon claimed he was going to bring with him the silent majority. And that's a phrase that has entered the political and the social lexicon of the Republic and has remained ever since. This silent majority, Nixon claimed, was the majority of people in the United States who did not engage in public protest and did not believe in fighting, and that did believe in fighting the war to an honorable conclusion. A very telling statement right there, honorable conclusion. It includes the prospect of not achieving total victory in the war. Now, peace talks began in Paris, but Ho Chi Minh was unable to use them to delay. He was able to use them to really delay anything until after because he understood that Nixon would not remove anybody from Vietnam. He would not pull the troops out until there was some wider political arc that he could use as cover. It's one thing to end the war, and it's another thing to end the war in a manner that doesn't really resolve anything or doesn't give you any sort of benefit to take back to your supporters or the people that you want to woo into supporting you. Now, and of course, Nixon didn't want to come off as weak against communism. That was a very damning charge during the entirety of the Cold War. So Nixon's decision in 1960 to widen the war, and that is to launch campaigns into Cambodia, set off an even greater wave of campus demonstrations, most notably at Kent State, where the National Guard opened fire and killed 4 student onlookers. Now, the outcome of the Vietnam War influenced the United States in profound ways. The United States did not fully disengage from the war until 1973, though there was a pretty large-scale de-escalation of force after Nixon's attacks on Cambodia. American prisoners of war returned home in trickles and in waves, though some people still hold that there are still Vietnam-era prisoner of wars being held in Vietnam. Now, the Watergate crisis that we'll get to much later when we examine Nixon's presidency in greater detail, the Watergate crisis of 1972-1974, and the unpopularity of the war prevented the United States from ever returning to Vietnam, even after North Vietnam launched army attacks and conventional warfare attacks against South Vietnam and finally overran it in 1975. Now, the brutal repression of the South Vietnamese by their North Vietnamese brethren led many in the Republic to rethink their approach to the war. The desperate escape of the Bo people trying to escape from the communist regime after 1975 also harkens to mind this sort of image and also bears this back into thought. Now, the second thoughts, these second thoughts were compounded by the even worse atrocities committed during the Cambodian genocide of the 1970s. Many neoconservatives, and that is new era or new wave conservatives, would later view the war as completely justified in light of what followed the communist takeover. The Vietnam War introduced what is called Vietnam Syndrome, and that is that the army needs to be very cautious before committing itself to foreign adventures. It must restrict the media's access to the theater of war, and very closely and before going to war, the politicians must have an exit strategy and a set list of goals to achieve while the army is in action, while the army or the Navy or any of the branches are in action. Now, the conclusion from Vietnam was that war is only going to be popular if it is short. That is the general idea. That was the general main takeaway from Vietnam. Keeping casualties as low as possible also became a new top priority for American forces. Before then, battles happened and death happened as dictated by the flow of battle, by the course of the battle. All these factors will come together and influence future American wars, most notably the Gulf War, and we will sort of examine the Gulf War and Vietnam. The Gulf War is often seen as the textbook lesson book, the textbook example for the lessons of Vietnam. But that is the end of our broad lecture on Vietnam. When we come back, we'll begin an analysis of Vietnam, in which we'll go back even more and more closely scrutinize and examine what exactly happened during Vietnam, what the big takeaways, the big interactions were of Vietnam. We'll also take a closer look at Ho Chi Minh, a figure still, given the fact that he was a great leader, a great military leader, and someone who has a lot of interesting involvement in United States history, someone who is still really relatively unknown in the United States. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.